How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
After a decade in the political wilderness, climate is now a regular on the national agenda. Politicians who ignored the issue are now talking about it. Elected officials who've been talking about it are being pressed to act on it. Washington Governor Jay Inslee has been a climate advocate for much of his career. In 2007, he spoke at the Commonwealth Club about Apollo's Fire, a book he co-authored calling for an ambitious plan to get off fossil fuels. He's been focused on climate issues since and recently folded his presidential campaign, in which he branded himself as the climate candidate. Later in the show, we'll talk with Republicans and Democrats about climate as the election season begins to heat up. The politics of climate, today on Climate One. Beto O'Rourke came out big recently, went to Yosemite, came out with an ambitious climate plan that got a lot of attention. $5 trillion over 10 years, zero emissions by 2050. You had a tit and tat back for him. So what do you think of Beto's plan?
Well, listen, I have been leading on this for at least a decade and a half. I actually ran for Congress in 1992 in this issue, wrote a book in 2007. I introduced bills in 2003. I joined Jerry Brown in forming the U.S. Climate Alliance, and now has 24 states. We formed the U.S. Climate Alliance because we wanted to make sure the rest of the world knew there was intelligent life in the United States, and that has been very productive. I've now passed some of the most meaningful climate legislation in American history. I'm very confident that I have a unique ability to lead this nation. Look, I favor and I appreciate anybody following my leadership, anybody, anywhere. And I'm happy that that's now happening. I think it's wonderful that candidates have discovered climate change in the last several days. I think that is a productive thing. And I'm looking forward to debate. I've actually asked the Democratic Party to have the first debate ever during the primary devoted to a discussion of climate change. And I think that's very important to have that. So I'm very confident that my leadership is having an impact, and I'm looking forward to that discussion.
Beto O'Rourke also recently signed, in the last couple of days since he announced his plan, signed the No Fossil Fuel Pledge. He also said he's not going to take PAC money. You have one of the few super PACs operating the Act Now on Climate Change. So your view on PAC money and fossil fuel money in the campaign?
Well, first off, my view is that we have to have a candidate who is willing to stand up to the oil and gas industry, number one. And that's why from day one I said I'm not taking oil and gas or coal money, and I'm the candidate who did that. I didn't need any convincing, unlike the other candidate you just mentioned. And the reason is that we have to break the back of the ability of this industry to hold us shackled to fossil fuels. We have to have a candidate who's willing to go toe-to-toe with this industry, who has not taken $500,000 from them, who hasn't voted for to allow offshore oil drilling, and is willing to fight to say that we should take away that $27 billion of taxpayer subsidy money and take that money and put it in clean energy. So I've taken quite a strong stance in this regard, and I'm not going to speak ill of any group that's working to defeat climate change. This has to be everybody pulling on the rope at the same time, and that's where I come down on this.
Barack Obama ran on hope and change. Mm-hmm. You're writing on fear of climate change. Do you think this is a winning message, talking about something that a lot of people think is scary and they don't want to think about?
Well, let's be clear. Those of us who believe it is American destiny to lead a clean energy revolution and defeat climate change are not the fearful people and are not the pessimistic people. Donald Trump is the insecure, fearful person who is too pessimistic to understand the innovative capabilities of Americans to create a new clean energy economy. And we are doing that right today in this state. I visited several businesses and talked to business and working people in the last 2 days in California, looking at the development of electric cars, I talked to folks who did one of the largest solar panel installations in the country in Nevada last week. I've talked to the people who are installing wind turbines in Iowa and solar panels. I had to argue with Meghan McCain on The View a few weeks ago, and she said, you pesky Democrats are going to take away our planes and our trains and our automobiles. And I said, well, that's funny, because this morning I have a shiny blue General Motors all-electric Bolt charging in the governor's driveway, made by American auto workers in Orion, Michigan. That's the vision statement that we believe in, because we are the optimists, we are the people who are determined, and we are the people that understand that this is a can-do nation full of can-do people.
The Green New Deal has really changed the national conversation on climate. I had here a couple days ago, sitting in that chair, Carlos Curbelo, former Republican member of Congress who did a lot on bipartisan with climate. He said, I don't agree with the New Deal, the Green New Deal, but it has started a conversation and opened it up.
Yeah.
Barney Frank, longtime liberal member of Congress from Massachusetts, said it's a loser in 2020 because it tries to do too much too fast. Your thoughts on the Green New Deal?
Well, I think it has been a real positive development for the national discussion for three reasons. Number one, it's got people talking about it, right? This is a thing that had, 4 minutes of debate in the last three presidential races. So anything that will get this even on the debate stage, even to provoke the Barney Frank, that's a good thing to wake up Barney, so that's a good idea. I love Barney Frank, by the way. Second, it has raised the ambition of the scope of what is necessary here. Look, this is a huge mobilization of the United States to build a clean energy economy, and I think it has raised people's ambitions levels. And three, and importantly, it has brought more people into the discussion. So we know who the first victims are of climate change. It's usually people living in poverty. It's the poor who are living next to the freeways, breathing diesel smoke, and as a result, having their kids having an epidemic of asthma. And so bringing in communities of color and those who have been the victims and indigenous communities, it has succeeded in this regard. Now, what we have to realize, though, is that we have to develop a suite of concrete, specific, tried proposals and policies that we know will work where the rubber meets the road.
Our guest today at Climate One from the Commonwealth Club is Jay Inslee, Governor of Washington, and I'm Greg Dalton. We're going to go to our lightning round, which I know the governor always appreciates. True or false, Governor Inslee, growing domestic oil production is good because it means America is less reliant on foreign oil.
Big false.
True or false, climate change will hurt your liberal friends in their lifetimes more than they realize.
True, and that's true for everybody. Don't pick on my friends. They're precious right now.
I'd like to mention a noun, and you just mention the first thing that comes to your mind when I mention carbon capture and sequestration.
The first thing that comes to mind may surprise you because it's topsoil in Iowa. Because there is a distinct possibility that we can use topsoil to sequester carbon at the same time we are reducing erosion from our agricultural lands, which is obviously a challenge. And when you mention carbon sequestration, most people immediately think of carbon capture from coal plants and the effort to bury it, which has not worked anyway economically.
True or false, you have thought about when to sell your oceanfront home because rising seas will diminish its value.
You say I have an oceanfront home? When did that happen?
Near Bainbridge, not
near my Bainbridge. That
Bainbridge,
one.
Bainbridge.
Well, I live high enough. Will probably be good for maybe half a generation anyway. Look, this is a real issue, right? So are there places now in our coastlines where there's going to become questions in the near future whether you can get insurance for your home? I was with the mayor of Miami Beach a few months ago where they've had to build up their road, their main street, about 1.5 feet, 2 feet. So when you shop now in Miami Beach, you look down at the shopping windows. It's the darndest thing. You walk down into the shops. We've had to design one of our water treatment plants in Anacortes, Washington. It's designed like a giant floating boat so that when we have sea level rise and concomitant floating, the whole water treatment plant will effectively float. Wow. And the reason I point these things out are this is not something in the distant future. This is today. it is affecting it. The guy who sat next to me on the flight coming down here had a home in Westport, Washington, and he said in the last 10 years he has lost 100 feet of shoreline, so now he's only like 60 feet from the Pacific Ocean. And he sold his place last year because he realized what the future looked like. So this is a real-term issue, but thanks for caring about my home.
True or false, it's scandalous that Amazon paid zero federal income taxes in 2018 on $11 billion in profits.
We're doing something about that. We've done some new revenue positions in our state, which is going to have some of these businesses paying a fair share to help finance education and mental health care reform, and also saving our orcas, because we need to save our orcas, and I'm proud that I've got bills to do that and a way to pay for it.
True or false, realizing the depth and magnitude of the climate crisis has moved you to tears?
You know, interesting question. I've cried a few times in my life. I'm thinking of my dad right now. I'm not sure I've cried about climate change, but I have been very emotionally impacted when I'm down on the beach with my grandkids. My dad was a biology teacher, and he would take me down to the beach, and he would show me the little critters, and I can remember just being fascinated by them. My mom and dad worked on the slopes of Mount Rainier, revegetating the alpine meadows, and my mom's most favorite flowers in the alpine meadows are on the slopes of Mount Rainier. And it is deeply troubling to me when I look at my three grandkids and I realize that their grandkids or their kids may not be able to enjoy all of the joys that I have had. And fundamentally, this is about humans. It's about our joy. It's about how we enjoy having forests to hike in, and places to ski, and clams to dig, and fish to catch, and clean water, and dare I say it, air to breathe. This is a human issue. By the way, everybody talks about planetary crisis. The planet Earth is going to be fine. It's humans that are in trouble, okay? And so we have to understand, and so it is very emotionally compelling to me. And again, this comes back why I think I am uniquely qualified for this job, because I think I've embraced this for several decades. And what I've learned is when you have a hard job, you better get somebody who's up to it to do that hard job. To build the mobilization to defeat climate change that we have to build, that is of a scale and scope of what we had to do to defeat fascism, we better have somebody with a deep conviction, and my grandkids give it to me every time I see them.
Thank you, Governor. Climate is now higher on the national agenda than it's been in a decade, driven by an increase in fires, floods, and other natural disasters amplified by a destabilized climate. While Americans cope with this climate reality, the Trump administration is stomping on all federal efforts to address it and doubling down on fossil fuels. Democrats are rallying around the Green New Deal, a lofty vision for transforming the U.S. economy to run on clean energy. We're pleased to have with us Carlos Curbelo, a former Republican member of Congress from Florida and co-founder of the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus. Christine Pelosi is executive committee woman of the Democratic National Committee. She backed a proposal to ban campaign contributions from fossil fuel companies to Democratic candidates. Ryan Costello is a former Republican member of Congress from Pennsylvania. He's now managing director of Americans for Carbon Dividends, which supports a climate plan created by former Secretaries of State George Shultz and James Baker. He retired from Congress in 2019. Ryan Costello, your former district doesn't touch on the sea. It's the suburbs of Philadelphia and some rural areas. How is climate affecting the people you used to represent in Congress?
Hotter months of the year, hotter years. Whether you're in Pennsylvania, whether you're in Kansas, whether you're in Oregon, wherever you are able to identify a few changes to the detriment of all as a consequence of a changing climate. If you're along the coast, rising sea levels, threats to literally your infrastructure and your homes. If you're in the Midwest, the land that you can grow on has shrunk. Your crop season has shrunk. If you're in Oregon, in Northern California, the wildfires, and on and on and on. And we discover that, and I think that this is really where the conversation has to go now and in the next few years to come, is what the cost of climate change truly is, because I don't think that any one particular voter has a full appreciation for that on a macro level. They tend to focus it on a micro level, and then they ask the question, well, I know I have this little problem here, but how is carbon pricing, or how is this regulation, how's that going to fix my backyard? And I think that that's one of the challenges that we have in political discourse.
Right, and Carlos Curbelo will often talk about, oh, we can't do this fix because it will cost too much. But people don't think about the cost of not fixing it, right? We had Harvey, Maria, Irma, Midwest floods, oh yeah, Florence in the Carolinas. And I mean, we're up over $100 billion in damages for these things, not entirely caused by climate, but partly. So how do you address the cost of versus the cost of inaction and the cost of action? Because it's always the cost of action that seems to be too much.
Right, and that's the challenge, that in many ways this is still an invisible issue despite everything that Ryan has explained, because, well, if there's a natural disaster, Congress just passes a supplemental bill and then that solves everything. But a lot of people don't realize we're paying for that. I mean, those are resources that we won't be able to use either today or in the future on education, on transportation, and all the other national priorities. So I would spend a lot of time in my district just educating voters, and I think everyone in elected office needs to educate voters, and those of us who care about this issue, activists as well, we need to spend time educating voters with the mindset that we're trying to convince them, not lecture them or shame them, because I think that's the most effective way to bring people to our side. And I think especially after campaigns, we need to find ways to work together. And the truth is, of course, Republicans are responsible because for 2 decades they've just balked on the issue completely. But in some ways, I think Democrats and some liberal groups have been complicit because they've doubled down on this dynamic in our country where Republicans don't want to be part of the solution, don't want to have a conversation, and Democrats want to own the issue entirely. We live in a country where the Founding Fathers established a government that's designed to work by consensus. I think we made a lot of progress. We went from having 4 or 5 Republicans in the House who were even willing to acknowledge this issue to having 45 join the Climate Solutions Caucus, acknowledge that this is a real threat and that the government has a role in solving it. We're seeing the fruits of all that work pay off today, because you have leading Republicans today saying, oh no, this is a real issue and our debate should be about solutions. Well, that's a lot better than what we were, the discussion or the non-discussion or the absurd discussion we were having 4 or 5 years ago. And that's the goal for me, to solve this. I don't care who gets the credit. No one should. But if we just double down on the politics of the day where this can only be an issue for Democrats, then that's going to keep us farther and farther away from a solution.
Christine Pelosi, does Carlos Curbelo deserve credit for creating a middle there, growing this bipartisan group in Congress?
Well, sure, everybody needs to join the conversation, and it's good that he did, and he brought 40 people with him. I think that from my perspective, again, I spend most of my time not only fighting Republicans, but fighting other Democrats. So I have a different perhaps a different perspective, because the way I look at it, it's more regional, and it has a lot more to do with a couple of things. One is the existential threat that climate change presents, and the other is the dialogue in which people from poor communities, frontline communities, indigenous communities, mining communities, industrial communities say, well, it may be true that the ecology as we know it is going to change in a dozen years, but your change is going to change my family's economy in 2 years. And so even within the Democratic Party, I had a big fight over trying to get oil money out of the party, trying to pass a Green New Deal a year ago in the DNC. And there were people who some people just want to take corporate money, and I couldn't stop them. So that was a piece of it. Other people said, we don't want to have climate policy unless everybody is sitting down at the table together. And if you look at the fight yesterday, Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, was signing a Green New Deal inside City Hall of Los Angeles, and outside labor unions were yelling at him, concerned that it was the new jobs that were going to be created were not going to be for them. So I think that every time you're trying to convince somebody to make a change, it comes down to two things. First of all, they don't like their current situation, but they're menaced by what change looks like. So you have to build the trust that they're actually going to get there. And I think that beyond partisanship, what we need to do regionally and within industrial and indigenous communities in particular is have that basic dialogue where someone is saying, your industry is poisoning my water, and the other person says, okay, but I need a job. What job am I going to get if I'm not in the industry that happens to have runoffs that poison your water? And that's the human-to-human dialogue, I think, is going to transcend the partisan dialogue very quickly.
Christine Pelosi, is a bipartisan deal less likely now that there's fewer Carlos Curbelos and Ryan Costellos to do deals with in Congress?
Well, in the House, it's still possible. It all depends on Trump. I mean, when you have the president, you have the president's signature. So the question is he going to make a deal or not? If he decides on a number, then you can make a deal. We'll find out when they return in a couple of weeks with their numbers. But that was always the question during the campaign was in the presidential campaign. When Trump said he wanted to do infrastructure, he was a builder, people thought, okay, well, he's built things before. He has a commitment to this. And even though he has seemed to side with some of the climate deniers when he did his golf courses, he certainly was building them to spec on coastline so they didn't sink. So he was taking climate into account when it came to his own, personal investments in Mar-a-Lago and Westminster and in Scotland and other places. So I think that the answer is it depends on whether or not the president wants to sign the bill. If the president wants to sign the bill, there's a deal to be made. If he doesn't, then there won't.
I want to harken back to Waxman-Markey passed the bill, passed through Congress almost exactly 10 years ago. And this was back in the day when Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich sat on a couch together. Remember, there was some bipartisan support. And I just want to call out, there were 8 Republicans who voted for Waxman-Markey. And I think it's important to remember Mark Kirk, Mike Castle, Mary Bono Mack here in California, Dave Reichert, John McHugh, Frank Libiondo, Chris Smith, and Leonard Lance, 8 Republicans. And when they voted for that bipartisan deal, Carlos Curbelo, Rush Limbaugh was outraged. He said they had ties to Wall Street. They should be sent packing. And some of them lost. So there can be real pain for people who cross that aisle and to do a deal. So what does that say about doing that now?
At the end of the day, people have to lead. And people have to care more about the country than about their reelection. So I don't feel sorry for people who are worried about what Rush Limbaugh or Rachel Maddow or Sean Hannity or anyone else says. If you are an elected leader of this country, you have a fiduciary responsibility to your constituents and to the country and to no one else. So yeah, perhaps leading on climate could make some Republicans vulnerable in a primary. Perhaps negotiating with Republicans could make some Democrats vulnerable in a primary. Too bad. That's what you signed up for, and we need you to do your job. That's the approach that I tried to take every single day. I know Ryan did too. I certainly wasn't perfect in Congress, and I made mistakes, but every day I was just willing to do whatever was best for my community and the country. And anyone who's not doing that shouldn't be in Congress.
Ryan Costello, will your group provide political cover and even financing for Republicans who want to take some risks on climate? You have a centrist plan backed by ExxonMobil and Walmart and the elders of the Republican Party, but people are going to be afraid of primary challenges. Will your group give them some political cover?
Yeah, that's the objective. The objective is to do both legislative advocacy in furtherance of informing voters on what is in the bill, as well as back-end political support through a super PAC that has not yet been created yet. I just want to pick up on one thing that Carlos said there, and he's absolutely correct. You see this on the left, you see this on the right, but I think particularly amongst Republicans on issues of climate, on gun safety and immigration, If you're not willing to take on your party a little bit, you're not going to be able to push this stuff out into the middle where you can get some consensus. And I do think in 2018, for as much as it was a referendum on the president in a lot of Republican districts, you do have to demonstrate that you're trying to find some consensus. And I think the American public is there on all three of those issues. There's no reason why we shouldn't have been able to get an immigration deal done over the summer. There's no reason why we shouldn't have universal background checks. And there's no reason why, even if we're not ready to do carbon pricing, that on streamlining some of the energy permits and taking the ARPA-E and some clean energy technology and pushing and accelerating that innovation, those are things that I think 80 to 90% of the country can all agree with. And particularly on the Republican side, we are not going to be able to move forward, I think, in a meaningful way where the center of the country looks at us and says, I have my issues with the Republican Party, or I'm a supporter of the Republican Party, but they're out there laying out bold ideas, and they're willing to take the heat. And if we're going to be scared of what they're saying on talk radio or after 9 p.m. on Fox, then we are going to be victims of our base. And I think that that's a really bad place for any political party to be. The Democrats have their own set of challenges, but I always think that each political party should be looking within themselves and identifying how they have to change, and spend a little less time saying, what's wrong with, if you're a Republican, saying what's wrong with the Democrats, or if you're a Democrat saying what's wrong with the Republicans. Let each party kind of wrestle that out themselves.
Yeah, and let me just add quickly, the bottom line is that everyone has to make a contribution here. We know that we need a federal solution. All these reforms at the state and local level are important. They make a difference. But in order to solve this, we need a federal solution. And we know it has to be bipartisan. That means Republicans have to do their part. That means a lot of environmental groups who for 2 decades have become accustomed to just reflexively opposing someone because they have an R next to their name, they have to rethink their strategy too. And if there are Republicans who are working toward those bipartisan solutions in Congress, they may have to hold back a little, or even consider supporting Republicans who are trying to get us closer to the bipartisan solution that we need. So we kind of all have to hold each other accountable if we're going to get this done.
We've been talking about the politics of climate change with Carlos Curbelo, former Republican member of Congress from Florida, and Ryan Costello, Republican former member of Congress from Pennsylvania, and Christine Pelosi on the executive committee of the Democratic National Committee. Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you podcast. I'm Greg Dalton. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time, everybody.